FA fam, welcome in. It is the week 8 running back show. Going to be hitting you with some of our favorite starts and sits, guys that we're higher on and lower on for week 8. Cav, let's kick it off on a good note. Who are some of the starts of the week for you at running back?
We're going to start things off with Joe Mixon. They get the Indianapolis Colts this week. Mixon continues to be one of the best running backs in the league, averaging 22.1 PPR points per game. He's currently handling 62% of the rush attempts. However, he's only run a route on 38% of dropbacks, but is seeing a decent 11% target share. On a per touch basis, he ranks 11th in explosive run rate, 58th in missed tackles forced per attempt, and 34th in yards after contact per attempt, which isn't necessarily great. But as long as he continues to see 25 plus touches per game, the volume alone is going to make him one of the best fantasy running backs as long as his health holds up. This week, game script should definitely be in his favor as he faces a Colts defense that's allowed the third most rushing yards, 18th most touchdowns, but the 12th most PPR points to the position. This is a matchup we've already seen this year where Mixon racked up 178 total yards and a score. Mixon is a locked-in top 5 running back this week. Next up is Devon Achane versus the Cardinals. The Dolphins designated Tua to return to play, and he's expected to practice Wednesday with the goal to play this week, which would obviously be a massive boost to this entire offense. Since Tua went down, HN hasn't scored more than 11 PPR points in a game. For reference, in the 2 games with Tua, HN scored 23 and 29 fantasy points respectively. If Tua is able to return, HN will be in a great matchup against a Cardinals defense that has yielded 25.9 PPR points per game, which is the 8th highest rate in the league. Aaron Jones is up next. Through 6 games, Aaron Jones is the RB11 in fantasy points per game, averaging nearly 17 points per game. Despite being 29 years old, he's shown zero signs of slowing down as he ranks 11th in explosive run rate, 28th in missed tackles forced per attempt, and 3rd in yards after contact per attempt. He's eclipsed 100 total yards and has scored 18 or more PPR points in 4 of his last 6 games. He's also been really good as a pass catcher as he ranks 9th in yards per route run while running the 6th most routes. This week, the Vikings and Aaron Jones have a quick turnaround with a Thursday night football game on tap against the Rams. The Rams have allowed 151.7 rushing yards per game, which is the 4th highest rate in the league. They've also allowed the 7th most touchdowns and the 11th most PPR points to the position. Aaron Jones is set up to smash this week, so if you got him, you're firing him up with confidence. Next up is DeAndre Swift. What a turnaround for Swift and the Bears rushing attack. After not eclipsing more than 8 fantasy points in a game through the first 3 weeks, Swift has scored 20 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. Over that 3-week span, Swift is averaging 18 carries, 4.3 targets, 134 total yards, and a touchdown per game. This week brings another opportunity to crush as the Commanders come to town. In 7 games, they've allowed the 6th most rushing yards, the 7th most touchdowns, and the 13th most fantasy points per game to running backs. Next up is Jordan Mason versus the Dallas Cowboys. After a scorching hot start this season, Mason has completely fallen off a cliff. He went from averaging 18.2 fantasy points per game over the first 4 games to just 8.9 fantasy points the last 3. One issue for Mason has been something we've really talked about a lot with him, and that is his non-involvement in the passing game. He's only seen more than 2 targets in a game once all year, which has made him completely touchdown dependent. On a per touch basis, Mason is still a solid runner as he ranks 3rd in explosive run rate, 2nd in made tackles. He is also averaging 5.1 yards per carry, which ranks 15th, but his 6% target share is limiting his upside every single week. Well, good news for Mason. This should be a week that we see Mason get back into the RB1 conversation. Dallas Cowboys and their depleted defense is coming to town. The Cowboys have allowed the 4th most PPR points to running backs while making Mason a plug-and-play RB2 this week. Next up is Kareem Hunt versus the Raiders. Since taking over as the Chiefs lead back in week 4, Kareem Hunt is averaging 21 carries, 2 targets, and 95 total yards, and 1 touchdown to go for with 17.1 PPR points per game. While he hasn't been as efficient as a runner, he continues to see a monster workload, and this sets up for more of the same with a matchup against the Raiders. The Chiefs are big road favorites, and Hunt gets a defense that has allowed the 6th most PPR points to position. Next up is Javonte Williams. After not scoring a touchdown the first 6 weeks of the season, Javonte found pay dirt twice last week against the Saints. He had his best games. This was his best games his rookie season with 111 total yards on 17 touches. He's finished with 26 fantasy points and has now put up RB1 weeks in 2 of the last 3 games. This week, Javonte gets by far his best matchup for running backs. The Panthers have been absolutely dreadful against the run this season. They've allowed the most rushing yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points to running backs, making Williams a rock-solid RB2 this week. Next up is J.K. Dobbins versus the Saints. I don't think anybody thought J.K. Dobbins was going to be as good as he's been coming off a torn Achilles. Dobbins is currently the RB14 in fantasy points per game. He ranks 17th in explosive run rate, 23rd in missed tackles forced per attempt, but ranks 46th in yards after contact per attempt. Considering Dobbins was a double-digit round pick, he's easily paid off his draft price since then. This week, Dobbins takes on a Saints defense that has been thrashed on the ground as they've allowed the 5th most rushing yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points per game on the season. Dobbins should be top 15 running back this week. Next up is Najee Harris versus the Giants. The last 2 weeks, we have seen Najee play really good football. He has put up 16 and 20 fantasy points while putting up 100 yards in both games as well. He's been really good from an efficiency standpoint as well. He's third in evaded tackles, 18th in yards after contact per attempt, and a 17th in elusive rating. What ultimately limits his ceiling is his lack of involvement in the pass game. He's 38th in routes run, but he's seeing an 11% target share, which does rank 17th among all running backs. Harris remains a game script dependent, and this game sets up as a game we should be able to trust him with the Giants on tap. The Giants have allowed the 11th most rushing yards and the 14th most fantasy points to running backs. Lastly, another option that can be viewed as a flex play, Rico Dowdle should be a decent option before the Cowboys were destroyed in week 6. That'll put together 2 strong performances. Coming off their bye, the Cowboys will take on a 49ers defense that has been middle of the road against running backs this year.
The only guy that I will tack on here in terms of starts is going to be Josh Jacobs. He's been okay for the majority of the year. Did not have any running back 1 weeks except for 2 of the past 3 weeks. And now he's going to get a matchup against Jacksonville, who have allowed the 6th most fantasy points per game to the position. Josh Jacobs is 6th in weighted opportunity share as well. So this sets up to be a game where I'm probably going to have him ranked higher than I have for the past several weeks. So like Josh Jacobs in this one. Let's flip the script, Kev. Let's talk about some guys that you are lower on. Who are some guys you're potentially thinking about sitting at running back for week 8?
I think you have to start with Tony Pollard to get the matchup against the Lions. While Tony Pollard has been phenomenal with 4 top 15 performances so far this season, this game does not set up well for the Titans. The Lions have limited opposing running backs to the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running back so far this season. So whether it be game script or matchup, I'm not all that excited to play Pollard this week. Next up is Alvin Kamara versus the Chargers. The Saints' offense has been absolutely dreadful since losing Derek Carr to IR. Last week against the Broncos, Kamara manages 24 total yards and failed to find the end zone. This week, the Saints travel to LA to take on a Chargers defense that has allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to running backs. If Kamara is going to get there, it will have to be through the passing game, as he has seen 7 or more targets in 4 straight games. You probably aren't sitting Alvin Kamara at this point, but I would limit my expectations nonetheless. Next up is Alexander Mattison. While Alexander Mattison has taken over the backfield, is averaging 14.6 fantasy points per game over the last 3 games. This is not the week I want to play him at all. The Chiefs have shut down every running back this season and have allowed the fewest fantasy points to running backs, making him the easiest sit of the week. And just for context, the Chiefs, when it comes to fantasy points per game, the Chiefs have allowed only 14 fantasy points per game to running back. The next closest is 17. So they're allowing 3 fewer fantasy points per game to running back. So I want no part of that situation whatsoever. And then Chase Brown versus the Eagles. Chase Brown looks like he has taken over the backfield from Zach Moss. Brown received 17 total touches last week to 9 touches to Moss. But much like last week, this is not the ideal match. The Eagles looking much like a pass funnel at this point. The Eagles have allowed these 6 fewest fantasy points to running backs, due in large part because they've only allowed 1 touchdown on the ground this season. So I just don't love Chase Brown. I think if he was more involved in the passing game, I think he'd be a little bit safer of a pick. But because he's limited in that regard, and we're seeing Zach Moss play more of a 3rd down role, it is really limiting Chase Brown's upside. So in a matchup like this, so I probably would not play Chase Brown if I didn't have to. And then lastly, the Giants running backs here in a matchup against the Steelers. One, I just don't really love the matchup. Steelers defense obviously been phenomenal. I don't expect the Giants offense to be able to get a whole lot done against that defense. And right now, Tyrone Tracy and Devin Singletary are kind of splitting touches, though it does look like Tyrone Tracy might have a bigger role than what we were expecting. But either way, it just doesn't set up well for either one of those running backs.
Yeah, someone who's not necessarily a sit for me, but I'll be, having lower in my ranks this week is going to be Kyren Williams in that matchup going up against the Vikings. I know Gibbs just tore them up. They gave up a bigger game to Jordan Mason earlier in the year as well. But Kyren Williams and Jahmyr Gibbs are not the same running back whatsoever. So he's going to be someone who, if you have him, you're plugging him in because of the workload he's going to see. But you're not going to be expecting the RB1 weeks that he's been putting up over the past few weeks. And then the other situation that I just want to touch on quickly, the Falcons going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We were told that we were going to get a 3-headed monster with the Bucs backfield, and that's exactly what we got on Monday Night Football. You had Rachaad White getting 10 carries. Bucky Irving got 9. Sean Tucker got 5. Rachaad White and Bucky Irving got there for fantasy purposes, mostly due to some garbage time production. But going up against the Falcons, who've allowed the 7th fewest points to opposing running backs, I'm going to be pumping the brakes on them. They become more, like RB2 flex type of plays. and especially depending on what's going to happen with the wide receiver position. We had Mike Evans leave with a hamstring injury, and it sounds like it was a pretty nasty ankle injury for Chris Godwin at the end of that game. So if that's the case, and they're going to be down to Jalen McMillan, Sterling Shepard at wide receiver, that running game is going to have a really rough time. So those are actually two guys I would debate on sitting this week. That is going to wrap it up. Any start-sit questions you have at the running back position, you can go ahead and drop them in the comments below. Don't forget to hit us with a like and a sub as well. We'll also be going live on Wednesday night for our weekly start-sit show, so you can ask questions over there as well. Good luck in week 8, and we'll talk to you soon.